Looking at a comprehensive set of lecture notes today on regulation of blood glucose level and carbohydrate metabolism. And I know those words usually make people think of dusty textbooks or counting calories, but biologically, this is the story of how you keep the lights on.
It's the fuel line. And if that line gets pinched or, flooded, the whole system just crashes.
Exactly. It's the difference between consciousness and a coma. And what struck me immediately looking at these slides is how terrifyingly small the margin for error actually is.
That was the first thing that jumped out at me, too. I mean, we aren't talking about a vague, healthy vibe here. We're talking about a specific hard number. Slide 2 mentions that a normal fasting blood glucose is strictly between 70 and 110 milligrams per deciliter. That feels like an incredibly narrow window.
It is incredibly narrow. To give you a visual, you have about 5 liters of blood in your body. 100 milligrams per deciliter equates to roughly 1 teaspoon of sugar dissolved in your entire blood supply. That's it.
1 teaspoon.
1. If you drop to half a teaspoon, you pass out. If you go to 2 teaspoons, you're starting to damage your organs.
So why the obsession with that specific number? Why is the body so strict about this? Why can't it just, roll with the punches a bit more?
It comes down to 2 very demanding customers in your body: the brain and the red blood cells. The notes call them obligate glucose users.
Obligate sounds like a legal term, like they have no choice.
They don't. That's the critical insight here. Most of your body is flexible. Your heart, your biceps, your liver, if there's no sugar available, they can switch gears. They can burn fatty acids. They're hybrids.
Okay.
But the brain, under normal physiological conditions, it cannot burn fat. The fatty acids literally can't cross the blood-brain barrier efficiently enough to sustain it.
So while my legs might be fine running on fat reserves, my brain is upstairs screaming for sugar.
Precisely. If that glucose supply line cuts out, the brain starves immediately. It doesn't have a backup generator that kicks in instantly. That's why the body has built this incredibly complex, redundant system to defend that 70 to 110 corridor at all costs.
Okay, so we've got this narrow lane. Let's map out what happens when we swerve out of it. The notes break this down into the ceiling and the floor. Let's start with the ceiling. Slide 3 talks about the renal threshold.
Right. So imagine your kidney is a dam. Its job is to filter your blood, clean it, but keep the valuable stuff, like glucose, inside the body. It recycles it. But that dam has a height limit, and that limit is the renal threshold, which sits around 180 milligrams per deciliter.
And if we spike past 180?
The dam breaks. The kidneys simply cannot hold it back anymore, and the sugar spills over into the urine. That's called glycosuria.
Which is actually how they used to diagnose diabetes back in the day, right?
Yeah, ancient physicians would literally taste the urine to see if it was sweet.
I am very glad we have modern blood tests.
You and me both. So that's the ceiling. It's wasteful and damaging long term. But the floor is immediate danger. This is hypoglycemia.
The notes categorize this into 3 levels, and the progression is honestly scary. Level 1 starts at anything under 70 milli-GDL. This is the alert value.
Right. This is when you get hangry, you get shaky, maybe a little cold sweat, your heart starts beating a little faster. It's your body sounding the alarm, saying, hey, we are drifting out of the lane. Eat something now.
Then level 2 drops below 54 milli-GDL.
Now you're in clinically significant territory. Your cognitive function starts to slip. You might slur your words, get confused, or lose coordination. Your brain is sputtering.
And level 3. The notes don't even give a number for level 3, which I found really interesting. It's defined by status.
Yeah. Altered mental or physical status requiring assistance. That is the clinical way of saying you are so far gone that you cannot help yourself.
You can't open a juice box.
Can't open the juice box. You can't dial 911. You need a rescue.
It really puts into perspective why we have this complex machinery running in the background. It's not just about having energy for a jog. It's about keeping us out of that level 3 zone.
Correct. And to do that, the body uses a balancing act.
Which brings us to the core visual of this deep dive. Slide 4 shows a simple balance scale. On the left, we have entry, what fills the glucose bucket. On the right, utilization, what empties it. It seems simple, but the ways we fill that bucket are surprisingly complex.
It's a classic input-output equation.
Let's look at the entry side first. Obviously, number 1 is diet.
Right. You eat a bagel, you digest the starch and sucrose, it gets absorbed into the portal vein as glucose. That's the direct line.
But humans don't eat 24 hours a day. We sleep. We fast. So what happens at 4 a.m. when I haven't eaten in 10 hours?
That's where the second source comes in, glycogenolysis. That's the breakdown of stored glycogen.
Now, this is where I hit a fact in the notes that actually made me laugh out loud. Slide 5 describes the muscle as being, well, selfish.
It is the classic biochemical drama. It's the tale of two organs. We store glycogen in two main places, the liver and the muscles, but they have very different personalities.
Break it down for us. Who is the good guy?
The liver is the altruist. It's the philanthropist of the body. When blood sugar drops, the liver breaks down its glycogen stores and ships that glucose out into the blood specifically to feed the brain and the rest of the body.
And the muscle?
The muscle acts like a doomsday prepper. It hoards its glycogen. Even if the brain is starving, even if the blood sugar is crashing, the muscle refuses to release its glucose into the bloodstream.
Why? Is it just stubborn?
It's a matter of plumbing. To get glucose out of a cell and into the blood, you need a specific enzyme called glucose 6-phosphatase.
Okay.
The liver has it. The muscle simply doesn't. Evolution decided that if a muscle has fuel, it should save it for running away from a tiger, not sharing it with the rest of the class.
That is a huge distinction. So liver glycogen is a public fund. Muscle glycogen is a private savings account.
Exactly. The muscle says, I'm keeping this for me.
Now, what happens if the public fund runs dry? Say you're fasting for a day or two, or you're on a keto diet.
That's the third source on the list, gluconeogenesis, which literally translates to making new glucose.
It sounds like magic.
It's biochemical alchemy. The body starts scavenging. It takes lactate, it takes glycerol from fat, and it takes amino acids from your proteins, and it chemically constructs new glucose molecules from scratch in the liver.
So it's taking the furniture and throwing it into the fireplace.
In a way, yes. It's an expensive process energetically, but if the alternative is the brain dying, the body pays the price.
Okay, so that's how we fill the bucket. How do we empty it? The utilization side on slide 6.
The main drain is just living energy. That's aerobic glycolysis, taking glucose, running it through the cycle, and making ATP, which is the fuel currency of the cell.
And if we have excess input, if I eat more than I burn,
we store it. First, we top off those glycogen tanks in the liver and muscles. That's glycogenesis. But those tanks are small. They hit capacity pretty fast. Think of them like the gas tank in your car.
And once the gas tank is full,
then we move to long-term storage, lipogenesis. We convert that excess glucose into triglycerides fat and store it in adipose tissue.
Which has unlimited capacity, unfortunately for us.
Limited. The body is very optimistic about how much energy we might need for the next famine. It never says enough fat.
There's one other drain listed here called the HMP shunt. It sounds like a secret passageway in a spy movie.
It's a bit of a side quest for glucose. Instead of burning it for energy, the body uses this pathway to turn glucose into raw materials, specifically ribose for making DNA and RNA. So this is about construction and maintenance, not just fuel.
So we have this seesaw, inputs versus outputs. But a seesaw doesn't balance itself. Someone has to be standing there managing the weights.
Enter the hormone teams.
And this is where the story gets really interesting to me. Looking at slide 7, this is not a fair fight. It's completely lopsided.
It really is. It's David versus a very large Goliath.
On one side, we have Team Hypoglycemic, the team dedicated to lowering blood sugar. And the roster has exactly one player.
Just one. Insulin.
Yeah.
It is the lonely hero. In the entire human body, insulin is the only hormone capable of lowering blood sugar.
That seems incredibly risky. What if it fails?
If it fails, or if the body stops listening to it, you get diabetes. There is no backup. But look at the other team, Team Hyperglycemic, the squad designed to raise blood sugar.
It's a mob. You have the captain, Glucagon, but then you have epinephrine, cortisol, growth hormone, ACTH, and thyroxine. It's 6 against 1.
Why do you think that is? Why would evolution design a system with 6 backups to raise sugar and only 1 to lower it?
I assume it goes back to what we said earlier, the brain dying.
Exactly. Think about our history. For 99.9% of human existence, the danger wasn't too many donuts or sugary lattes. The danger was starvation. The danger was the predator chasing you. Hypoglycemia kills you in minutes.
Right.
Hyperglycemia, high sugar, is bad, but it kills you slowly. It takes years or decades to do its damage. So nature prioritized the immediate threat. We are built with a hair-trigger defense against starvation. We have redundant systems to keep sugar UP. We only needed one system to bring it down because historically an abundance of food was a rare luxury.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
We are built for scarcity, living in a world of the buffet.
That is the fundamental tragedy of modern metabolism.
Let's give the lonely hero some credit here. Let's deep dive on insulin. Slide 8 breaks down exactly how this hormone gets released. And honestly, it reads like a Rube Goldberg machine inside the cell.
It is a beautiful mechanism. It takes place in the beta cells of the pancreas.
Walk us through it step by step. I just ate a sandwich. Sugar's in my blood. What happens at the cell door?
Okay, step 1. The glucose flows into the beta cell through a specific door called GLUT2. Once inside, the cell metabolizes it, burns it to make ATP.
Okay, so energy levels go up inside the cell.
Right. Step 2. That rise in ATP acts as a signal. It slams a specific door shut, the potassium channel.
So potassium is trapped inside.
Potassium's trapped. And because potassium has a positive charge, this changes the electrical voltage of the entire cell. It causes depolarization.
It's like an electric spark.
Exactly. Step 3, that electrical shift shocks a different set of doors open, the voltage-gated calcium channels.
So calcium rushes in.
Calcium floods the cell. And finally, step 4, that calcium influx is the physical trigger that kicks the insulin granules out of the cell and into the bloodstream.
It's amazing that this complex chain reaction, sugar in, ATP up, potassium door shuts, voltage change, calcium door opens, insulin out happens instantly, automatically every time I eat.
Every single time. It's biological automation at its finest.
So insulin is out in the blood. Its mission is the era of plenty. What does it actually tell the body to do? Let's look at slide 9 and 10.
It has different messages for different organs. For the liver, on slide 9, the message is store fuel, stop production. It tells the liver to turn on the fat-making machines and turn off the glucose-making machines.
But the message to the muscle and fat is different. Slide 10 talks about a lock and key.
This is a vital concept to understand. Muscle and fat cells are naturally locked. They have a door for glucose called the GLUT4 transporter, but normally those doors are hiding deep inside the cell. They aren't on the surface.
So the glucose is knocking, but no one is answering.
Exactly. Without insulin, the muscle literally cannot see the glucose in the blood. It could be swimming in sugar, but it starves.
Until insulin arrives.
Insulin binds to the receptor, that's the key, and that signal tells the cell to move those GLUT4 doors to the surface. Suddenly, the gates open and sugar pours into the muscle.
But here's the blinkest insight for me. The notes say, remember, brain and liver do not require insulin for glucose entry.
That's the VIP pass. The brain uses a different door, GLUT3. The liver uses GLUT2. These transporters do not need a key. They are always open.
Because the brain can't wait for the doorman.
Right. Even if your insulin system is completely broken, the brain can still pull sugar from the blood. It has priority access. It's too important to be locked out.
That explains why a diabetic might have extremely high blood sugar, but their muscles are wasting away. The muscles are locked out, but the brain is still eating.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's the hero. Now let's look at the opposition, the anti-insulin squad. I've got the captain, Glucagon, on slide 11.
Glucagon comes from the alpha cells of the pancreas. Its trigger is the opposite of insulin, low sugar. When you drop below that 70 milligerdilol mark, glucagon wakes up.
But there's a catch. Slide 11 says glucagon acts on the liver only.
This goes back to our selfish muscle conversation. Glucagon's job is to raise blood glucose to save the brain. Since the muscle refuses to release its glucose anyway, glucagon doesn't even bother talking to it. It has no receptors there.
That is ruthless efficiency. Don't ask for money from the guy who never pays.
Glucagon goes straight to the liver and says, empty the vaults, dump the glycogen into the blood. We need cash flow now.
Now let's move to slide 12, the heavy hitters, the stress hormones, epinephrine and cortisol. People often mix these up, but the notes make a clear distinction between panic and siege.
That's a great way to put it. Epinephrine or adrenaline is panic. It's acute stress. A tiger jumps out. You need energy now.
What does it do?
It overrides everything. It causes rapid breakdown of glycogen in the liver to spike blood sugar, but it also hits the muscle.
Wait, I thought the muscle wouldn't share.
It doesn't share glucose. But under the influence of adrenaline, the muscle breaks down its glycogen furiously to fuel itself for the fight. It burns it so fast it produces lactate. That lactate spills out into the blood, goes to the liver, and the liver turns that back into glucose.
So it's a roundabout way of contributing. It throws its trash to the liver, and the liver recycles it into fuel.
Exactly. Now, compare that to cortisol. Cortisol is the siege hormone. This is long-term stress, starvation, or just a really, really bad month at work.
What's its strategy?
Conservation and sacrifice. Cortisol essentially tells the body, we are in this for the long haul. It tells the muscle and fat cells to stop eating. It decreases their glucose uptake.
It makes them insulin resistant.
Yes. It induces insulin resistance to save the sugar for the brain, and worse, it starts breaking down your muscle protein to get amino acids to make more sugar via gluconeogenesis. It literally cannibalizes your muscles to keep the brain fed.
That explains why chronic stress is so destructive. You're melting your own muscles and spiking your blood sugar, all while sitting at a desk.
And your body thinks is helping you survive a famine.
Slide 13 rounds out the team with growth hormone and thyroid hormone, but the message is consistent. Keep sugar up.
Always.
We've covered the system working perfectly, but slide 14 lists the clinical disorders when the system breaks. Obviously, the big one is diabetes hyperglycemia.
Right. Either you don't have the key type 1, where you don't make insulin, or the lock is jammed type 2, where the cells stop responding. But there are other causes. If you have a tumor pumping out too much growth hormone or cortisol, you'll have high blood sugar because those hormones are constantly fighting insulin.
But on the flip side, hypoglycemia, there is a scenario here that I think a lot of listeners might recognize, or at least have seen in a movie. The connection between alcohol and low blood sugar.
Ah, yes. The Saturday night emergency. This is a classic biochemical trap.
How does it work? Why does a drink drop your sugar?
So imagine someone has been drinking heavily and they haven't eaten much. Their glycogen stores are empty. They're relying entirely on gluconeogenesis, that alchemy of making new sugar, to keep their brain alive.
Okay, so the liver factory is working hard.
But here's the problem. The liver is also the organ that processes alcohol. And chemically, the process of breaking down alcohol uses up the exact same resources, specifically a molecule called NAD+ capaceae that are needed to make new sugar.
It's a bottleneck.
It's a complete roadblock. The liver looks at the alcohol and says, this is a toxin, I have to clear this first. It prioritizes the booze. Gluconeogenesis stops.
And since they haven't eaten and the factory is shut down,
Blood sugar crashes. The person passes out.
and the dangerous part is they smell like alcohol, so people assume they're just sleeping it off.
Exactly. But actually, their brain is starving for fuel. It's a medical emergency masquerading as a hangover. If they don't get glucose, they could suffer brain damage.
That is a critical takeaway. It's not just the booze, it's the empty tank.
Correct.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from the Rube Goldberg cells to the selfish muscles. Let's bring it all together with the cheat sheet on slide 15, the seesaw.
It's the best way to visualize it.
On the left, pushing the seesaw down, lowering sugar, is the well-fed state.
Controlled by our lonely hero, insulin. It promotes storage, growth, and fat creation. It says times are good, save for later.
And on the right, pushing the seesaw up, raising sugar, is the fasting or stress state.
Controlled by the mob. Glucagon, adrenaline, and cortisol. They promote breakdown, production, and survival. They say, times are tough, burn everything to keep the brain alive.
It really is incredible to think that this seesaw is tilting back and forth every minute of our lives. We don't have to think about it. We don't have to manually adjust our insulin levels after a cookie.
If we had to consciously manage our blood sugar the way we manage our bank accounts or our emails, we'd be dead by lunchtime. It is the automation of survival.
But it does leave us with a lingering question. We have this robust 6-hormone team designed to save us from starvation.
Yeah.
And we have one solitary hormone designed to save us from abundance.
And we have built a world of permanent abundance.
We're constantly flooding a system that was designed for a drought.
Exactly. We are asking insulin to work overtime every single day against an evolutionary tide that never expected us to have 247 access to calories.
So the next time you feel that hangry shake or that post-meal slump, just remember the chemical war happening inside. It's 6 against 1, and your body's just trying to keep the lights on.
Absolutely.
Thanks for diving in with us. We'll see you in the next one.